Now that you know how to hold 4 mallets and you know how to stand at the instrument with proper posture, let's talk about the 7 different stroke types that you need to know in order to play 4-mallet marimba music. This is just an overview, so if you're just getting started playing, some of these will feel a little bit too difficult to try right now, and that's totally fine. Just bookmark this video and you can use it as a reference later as you're working through these different stroke types. The first stroke type we're going to talk about is the double vertical stroke. This stroke type is pretty straightforward and very similar to a technique you would use with 2-mallet percussion playing or snare drum playing. You're simply going to have both mallets in one hand strike the marimba at the same time. This is done through a simple bend in the wrist. We're not going to be bending the elbows very much when we're playing marimba at all. Next up is the single independent stroke. This is a stroke you use when you want one mallet to strike the instrument while the other mallet in the same hand remains stationary. And the real trick here is to keep that mallet that you're not using as still as possible. You achieve this stroke with a simple turn in the wrist, similar to the motion you would use if turning a doorknob. The single alternating stroke is a series of strokes that alternate between the inside and outside mallets in one hand. Again, just use a simple turn of the wrist, and there'll be one wrist motion for each note that you play. Double lateral strokes are kind of like a distant cousin of double strokes on a snare drum. With one wrist motion, you get 2 notes, one with each mallet in the same hand. These are used in faster music and certain types of rolls. This stroke begins with a wrist bend, just like the double vertical stroke, but then there's an immediate wrist turn, which is how you play the second note. A triple lateral stroke is just like a double lateral stroke, except that wrist turn produces 2 extra notes for a total of 3 notes in one hand. So once again, a wrist bend initiates the stroke, and then the wrist turn produces the next 2 notes. A one-handed roll is a series of quick, single alternating strokes. Unlike the single alternating stroke, a one-handed roll is a continuous twisting of the wrist, which produces enough strokes to create a sustained tremolo sound. And the last stroke type we'll talk about is the one-handed isolated accent. This is a stroke that you'll do when you're playing both notes in one hand, but you want one of the notes in your hands to be accented or louder than the other note. For this stroke, we're going to use a motion similar to that we used with the single independent stroke. There's going to be a turn of the wrist, which prepares the accented note, which will be higher above the marimba than the unaccented note. But both mallets are going to strike the instrument at the same time. So that means that the mallet playing the accented note travels towards the instrument faster than the mallet playing the unaccented note. We won't be talking about especially the one-handed roll and the one-handed isolated accent stroke until much later in this lesson series. So if you're trying them out right now and they're not working, don't worry about it. We've got plenty of time to get to those stroke types. The reality is that the longer you play, the more these different stroke types start to blur together. For instance, if you're playing two single independent strokes with two mallets in the same hand and you get going fast enough, eventually you're playing single alternating strokes. And if you play single alternating strokes and those eventually get fast enough, then you're playing a one-handed roll. If you're playing two single alternating strokes in one hand and eventually those get fast enough, that becomes a double lateral stroke. So there are times when you'll know exactly what stroke type you're using and the times where the lines become a little bit blurred. I do think that about 95% of the time you're going to have a pretty good idea of what stroke type you're using when playing four-mallet marimba music. And more importantly, focusing on these stroke types is a really great way to learn how to play with four mallets.